Hello, screenwriters, and welcome to Writing for Screens. Today's episode, I have thoughts on endings. My name is Glenn Gers, and I am the Chief Operating Everything at Writing for Screens, which is a YouTube channel in which I have tried to take some of the skills and tools and insights that I had to teach myself during a 25-year career writing for TV and movies. I'm trying to leave those behind in a convenient and useful way for those of you who are just starting out, so that you don't have to figure them out for yourself. You can just use them as your starting points to figure out what you want to do. There is no system, there is no right and wrong, there is no sure way to make a hit or get a job. There is just figuring out what kind of work you want to do, how you can do it, and then figuring out your own stuff that you need. That's all there is to writing. It's all about you choosing your own work and your own path and your own methods. All anyone can give you is some skills or some tools or some insights. So that's what I'm here to do. I come to you live every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for an hour of talk. But the main thing I do is I've got this channel. This is a little screen grab of the main page, and on it you will see the first three playlists. If you scroll down, there's three playlists: Screenwriting Essentials, Screenwriting Tools, Skills, and Craft, and The Process, Being a Writer. This stuff is where I have tried to condense down into 10-minute videos, little lessons, everything that I can think of that might be useful for you to try. It may work for you, it may not. No one knows until they do it. You can't know everything before you work. You got to try things out yourself and see how they work for you. So that's all I got to go here. Now, one of the things I want to talk about today is something that is not in those lesson videos. So I'm going to try to do the beginning of this live stream as condensed and clear as possible to make it into a little lesson that we can add to that list, because I got a comment on one of my videos, Our Ending Problem, which is about it's more of a philosophical essay on endings instead of a real how-to. And Simon, a year or so ago, wrote an essay wrote a comment that pointed out, that's not really the most helpful of all your videos. He said, I would love it if you went further and dealt with some examples from your own or other people's work, or some tips on tackling endings. As you all may know, I am not a big fan of analyzing other people's work. For one thing, none of us know how they got to the thing that we love or hate so much. You cannot really understand how a piece of art was made simply by looking at the finished product. So what I can do, I will talk a little bit, I will refer to some movies, but mainly I'm going to talk about a couple of basic ideas that might help you. And so let's get into that with the question of endings. Now, the first thing I need you to know is I am not going to do any spoilers, which makes it really hard to talk about other movies. I am going to mention a bunch that I'm going to say. You need to watch it yourself to understand what I'm talking about, because I'm not going to tell you the ending. I will, at the end of this video, put a list of the movies I'm mentioning in the description down underneath this video on the YouTube page, so that you can watch those movies at your own leisure and come up with your thoughts about those endings. I'm going to just use them as examples of types or strategies. Now, the first thing to know about endings is that there are two meanings of ending when you're talking about a movie or a script. One is just the last thing, the very last thing that happens. That's the ending. But really, the more important idea is that the events that resolve the story, which can, first of all, take quite a while. You could be the entire last 20 minutes of the story. And also, sometimes the events that resolve the story are not the very last thing. Sometimes you resolve the story, and then there's some what they call a coda, some extra scenes after that to tidy up some things or calm down from the big events. So the most important thing that you need to think about is that events that resolve the story. The last thing, it's great. It can be fabulous. And sometimes that is the event that resolves the story, depending on how it's structured. But it's not required. You don't have to have the last thing be the most important thing. I think one of the most important things to understand is that when you talk about the ending of a story, you're talking about the resolution of the things that are questions. The tension of the story will almost always be available to you, if you choose to look at it this way, in the form of questions. What's going to happen? How are they going to get away with that? Who's going to find out who done it? Whatever it is, there's questions which tend to be driving a story. And therefore, I think the most important thing is to remember that when you are thinking about the ending, you are thinking about that engine, that tension of a story, and what will resolve it. You don't have to have a happy ending. You don't have to have necessarily even a decisive ending. You can have an ambiguous ending, but no matter what, you need something that concludes that tension for the story. That is the most important thing. And I got to tell you, I believe that endings matter, that they are actually the single most important thing in writing a story. Because when you do an ending, when you decide how you're going to resolve this story, you are defining all the events and the questions. For instance, if you've got a story where someone is trying to pull a caper and rob something, or rob a bank or a jewelry store or God knows what, the resolution of that story, the ability to get away with it or to be punished for your transgressions, that is going to define what the movie is saying about that action, about that question, about that problem. Whatever ends the story is giving you at least the movie's view of how you are supposed to feel about that. There's a movie called Ocean's 11. The original Ocean's 11 ends very differently than the remake. The original, and by the way, I can't honestly recommend the original Ocean's 11. It's not a great movie, but it has an ending which suggests that even that crime does not pay. Whereas the remake is more coming down on if you're a cute, clever bunch of criminals, take it. Go. Anyway, the most important thing that I think you have to think about when you talk about resolving the story is, first of all, you have to know what the question is. What is the thing that is central to the story? What is the main problem for the characters, or the main issue that it is trying to make a statement about, or give some understanding of? Whatever that is going to be what your ending is about. So you need to know what your story's about. Sometimes you'll just say, oh, it's a war story about, this great battle. Well, that's not enough to drive a story. Then you're just like, this happened, this happened, this happened. The question is, will one side or another have made a grave error in taking on this battle? Or is this an example of how heroism or intelligence or something else can win the day? Those questions are going to be the way that you figure out your ending. Sometimes you know the ending from the start. Sometimes you say, I want to tell a story about how this little army fought this big army and they won. But sometimes you have a bunch of different things that are inspiring you or puzzling you or interesting you, and you only figure out what matters most as you work. It can be a very fluid, accumulating process, but eventually it has to lead to a crystallizing point, a moment at which the ideas coalesce into one central thought, statement, question, whatever it's going to be. That's going to be what the ending is about. So all I can say is, when you think about the ending, you have to think about, what is the story I'm telling? What is the question I am leaving unresolved? And what is it that I want to say about that? That's how you find your ending. Sometimes you find it logically, sometimes you find it emotionally. I wrote and directed a movie called Disfigured. It's about two women, one who's obese and one who is anorexic, and they become friends. And so there's a lot of different issues that I was trying to take on in that story. I had to think of an idea that crystallized for me what's the resolution for this story, even though the individual stories are not going to be totally resolved. You're going to get a sense of where they're headed, but not everything is solved. And so what I needed to do was come up with an idea. And what I came up with is these two women meet at a group. It's called a fat acceptance group. It's a sort of a support group and a political activism group. But they have trouble in being in the group. And at the very end of the story, and this one I am going to spoil, it ends with one of the characters starting her own group. And that once I realized, that's what she needs to do to continue on her journey of dealing with herself. But the last thing I came to was an image. And the image was of people raising their hands to speak. The important thing in this story was communication. And eventually I came up with an image, which is somebody says, does anyone want to speak in this meeting? And slowly but surely hands go up. And it was just shots of hands raising. And once I understood that, at first it was simply instinctive. I was like, oh, that would be cool. That it's a good image. I know how to shoot it. And it also says a thing without words. It says people want to communicate. People want to let their feelings out and to be heard and to be connecting. And once I had that image, I recognized the importance of that idea. So sometimes figuring out the ending will tell you what's most important to your own story. Even though you know you've got a lot of stuff you want to say and you've got events that you know are going to work or they're going to say what you want, but until you've tied them together with the statement of the ending, you aren't quite done. Now, it's not like there's a right answer. Somebody else could have done this, or I could have done it at a different time and come up with a different ending, and it still could have been good. The important thing is to recognize that you are making a choice when you end something, and that choice is making a statement or providing a feeling. Sometimes it's just a feeling. Sometimes there's no statement. It's not an answer. It's just a feeling which gives you a way to look at everything you've seen so far. The main thing about this is for you to figure out for you what that is. There are sometimes traditional endings, traditional resolutions. If you have for a long time, if you had a crime story, crime had to not pay. There are Hollywood endings, things that you can say, these people are going to get together and live happily ever after. And that is a possibility. It is no longer absolutely required. For a long time, it really was. There was a convention that you had to stick to. But you should have in mind, what are the possible Hollywood endings for this? What is the possible conventional view of this story? And decide whether or not that's right for you. Now, I personally don't feel like I can write something until I know the ending. It lets me understand my own work well enough to start writing it. However, it is possible to write a script without knowing the ending. I don't personally advise it because I advise what I think makes most sense to me. But you could simply start writing and sort of work it out as you go along, and maybe halfway through you figure out the ending, or maybe when you get to the end of the script, you have to make a choice then. The important thing about it is to know that eventually you're going to have to make a choice. You're going to have to define the story, and that if you hold off till the end in order to make that choice, you may have to go back and alter some things to make that choice happen. Like if you say, I want this murder mystery and I want that person to have done it, you may have to go back and plant some clues that person is the one who did it. So let me just give you another couple of thoughts about, first of all, just to point out, the ending, what I've been trying to say here is the ending is the choice that determines all the other choices. Now, you don't have to make it first, but sooner or later you're going to say, this is the defining point of the story. And I'm going to mention some movies later, like Inception. Now, Inception does not have a defining yes or no answer to the ending, and that in itself tells you what the movie wants you to ask yourself, to say, essentially it's a movie about dreaming. And essentially it's the point of that ending has got to be, you need to think about what there is in dreams and in reality. How do you know for sure which you are in and which would you choose? That's really, I think, for me, the message of that ending. Once again, I'm not going to spoil endings. But I would say one of the most important things is that an ending has got to release the audience. You've got to make sure that the audience understands it's the end. And there's a lot of ways that traditionally have been done to show you there's the famous, a lot of movies ends with essentially a crane shot, which the camera rises up and backs away in order to put the characters into the context of their world and essentially to let them go, to say, we're done. You can stop now. We are saying goodbye to the movie. Sometimes it's a hard cut to black screen, saying we're done. It's over. Very, very often there's music involved. But whatever it is going to be something that essentially releases the audience, that tells them it's over. And it also sets a final tone of the experience. Hold on. I'm just making some notes for things to add to the list of movies we're talking about. For instance, there's a movie, a fairly controversial, some people love it, some people hate it, movie that came out last year called Saltburn. Saltburn has a startling final sequence. It's startling for a bunch of reasons. It's not articulating, there's no statement of meaning. However, there's a very, very clear defining tone, a feeling, a sense of letting the audience go, and also narrowing down to what turns out to have been the center of the story. So one of the things about something like that is that very, very often endings rely on music or editing or a visual effect or the acting, the way somebody looks. I'm going to mention later the Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, the original version. The 1970s version ends with a look. I won't say more than that, but I will say that look is very, very important to saying this story is over. Now, the problem is you can't write that, okay? You can't write a look. You can't write a music cue. I mean, you can say this kind of music comes in, but you don't know for sure whether or not they can or will use that music. So what I would say is when you are writing a script, you want to suggest those things you can't control. You can say music swells or music slams in loud or he dances through the house. You can't say exactly how to shoot it. You can't say exactly how they are going to dance. You can only convey the idea of what is to be done or what is to happen. There is going to be a look, or there is going to be a silent moment, or there is going to be a dance. You're trying to convey the concept of the ending without overly trying to control, as a writer, things you cannot control. So it's really important to recognize that some of the magic of movies exists beyond the screenwriting stage. You can't write a lot of this magic, and yet a really good ending often has a sense of movie magic to it. Now, the other question that has arisen has been, have I ever written something where the ending changed? Because this happens a lot. There are plenty of stories where the ending changes. Sometimes it'll be changed during the writing process. In other words, when they're trying to work out the script before they shoot it, the ending will often change in a professional production. However, with Fracture, we actually shot, first of all, it took over a year and actually 3 other writers to come up with the ending that they did eventually go with. However, even then, we shot an ending and then had to, after the film was done, preview it, then stop and reshoot a different ending. The point about that, though, is that while the mechanics of that story were, the ending was changing and changing and changing, the idea of the ending was never in doubt. It was a Hollywood ending. It was a mystery story in which the question was, how are you going to catch the criminal? There was no doubt that the criminal would get caught. It was always about how it was going to be done. And very often when you are working on something, you have to be prepared for the fact that that choice you made, and this was hard for me, the choice that you made that defines the story, and then some producer or director or star will say, I don't like that ending. Can we do this other thing? And for you, that is literally redefining the meaning of the movie. However, as I said, with Fracture, you're not redefining the movie. You're just redefining how you're going to do it. The other question, I think, comes up about an ambiguous ending. Not every ending is a clear-cut statement, as I said. Very often there's mixed feelings or even an uncertainty as to how things are going to turn out or what the ending means. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's a little less commercial in the Hollywood sense. It's a little harder to sell that to the business. However, those endings are very often quite powerful and popular. The thing I would say about this is when you write something ambiguous or complex in your ending, you want to be essentially definitively ambiguous. You want to be clear that you are releasing the audience with a question. Or with the idea that we have to live with not knowing. You know, very often a story will end with the end of it's sort of like you've gotten to the end of the beginning of these characters' story, but their story will go on and we may not know exactly how it's going to go on, but at least we understand that this question of the beginning has been answered and now they will follow the new path and we don't really know how that will work out. I mentioned Inception, which clearly is about that. There is a definitive ending in which the question is clearly not answered. That may sound weird, but in fact, clearly not answering is an answer. To say you decide or you think about it, to be definitively ambiguous. There's a phenomenal movie by John Sayles. It's John Salesy, so it's very talky. But I love the ending. It's called Limbo, back from, I think, the early 90s. And Limbo has a decisively ambiguous ending. It's really cool. But then there's others where there's movies where it's not so much that it's unresolved, is that it's complicated. The Graduate. The Graduate has a decisive resolution of the story. But then at the very end, there's a moment, and once again, I'm trying not to spoil, but there's a moment that raises questions about, if not what they have done right or wrong, about where this will lead. And it's a very, very fabulous ending. Both sections, the resolution of the story and the moment of complexity or ambiguity after the resolution. Likewise, a movie called The Color of Money. Paul Newman, Tom Cruise, directed by Martin Scorsese, written by Richard Price. The Color of Money, it resolves the story, but there is a certain sense that we don't entirely know where these characters are going to end up later. And that's okay. You still feel cool about having that question presented as it's part of life. We don't know what the future will hold. There is no happily ever after in the sense that the story stops. Their stories actually go on. The other thing I want to talk about that you should think about is whether or not you want to resolve the story and then have a little coda after, a little something. And it could be as small in The Graduate. It's only a minute or two of film. But then you have something like Star Wars, Episode 4, the original, the first chronologically in our time Star Wars movie ends with a spectacularly well-built resolution to the story. And then there's this coda. There's a little celebration scene, which I really feel is extremely lame. It's fine. It does the job. To me, it was not great. On the other hand, there's a movie called Klute, Klute, directed by Alan Pakula, starring Donald Sutherland and Jane Fonda. Klute has a resolution to the story and then a coda scene, and it's a scene. It's some dialogue. It's a scene, a full new scene, and it's brilliant. And you need it. The story, even though the plot is resolved, the emotional story driving this mystery plot, this thriller plot, is unresolved even by the resolution of the plot. We find out who the bad guy is, we find out what's going to happen to him, and then we need to resolve the real story, which is about two other characters, the two main characters. Klute has a brilliant ending as far as I'm concerned. So sometimes that very last thing is key. Sometimes you want to give everyone a breathing moment and allow them to think about or feel or get over the intensity of whatever that resolution was. All right. So just very briefly to talk about some real movies that you can look at. That have the main thing is almost every good movie, every great movie has a great ending. It's almost impossible to have a movie that has a bad ending that's a great movie. So therefore, you can honestly look at any movie that you think is great and say, like, how does it end? You're going to be able to analyze the ending. But as I mentioned, Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, Oppenheimer is a case of bringing together a great many themes and ideas into a non-verbal but brilliant. Essentially, the entire structure has been a putting together of different pieces. And in the very end of Oppenheimer, without spoiling anything, it makes a statement or tells you what the reason for telling this story has been, and it does it entirely by weaving together images that we have already seen around a line. One of the big questions is: do you want to end with images or actions or words? The China Syndrome, phenomenal ending. A character, there's several main characters, and actually there's a minor character has the big moment in that ending. It's phenomenal. The Godfather, Goodfellas, Do the Right Thing. Then you have these great dialogue endings, great like famous last lines, like the Maltese Falcon. Seven. Seven is a really good example of a movie that has a story ending which has a very distinctive feeling, and then there's an extra layer of dialogue, voiceover, which gives it some perspective, and that ends the story. And it's very, very important that you have that last line. Likewise, a movie called Some Like It Hot. Then you get Barbie and The Apartment, just great last lines that tell you the movie's over, and give you a laugh and give you a certain satisfaction. And then there are some where there's a great last line, but then there's something after it. Famously, what people think is the last line of Gone with the Wind, Rhett's last line, is not the end of the movie. There's a reaction to that line. Likewise, Annie Hall, which has an amazing last line, last little speech, and then there's a little montage after it. Okay, so those, and there's just to talk about some movies that you might want to look at because they famously have changed endings. I can't get into those now because I don't want to spoil, but I would say research the endings of Chinatown, American Beauty, Get Out, and Fatal Attraction. All of those had radically rethought endings. And in some cases, I think that they were a good idea. I think that Chinatown and Fatal Attraction both are better. Actually, American Beauty too. The endings are better. I'm not sure if I agree with the ending of Get Out being changed. This is a case where both are good. One feels better, but probably in some ways says less. Anyway, so those are my thoughts. We're done on this little lesson. Now I'm going to go back and talk to you about your comments because I see a lot of comments here. I have, as I said in the description, not dealt with any comments while I got that lesson so that I can later, if I need to put this into the lesson portion of my channel, I can cut it down and we can just do that section that we just finished. All right, let's say, hello, Doug. Hello, Helene. Oop, there we go. Hello, Sonia. And Gregors and Michael. Hello, TT and Doreen. It always feels like the end of The Grinch when I'm just like, and you and you. Okay. Good. Yes, apparently the clocks have changed and Europe has an easier time finding me. Okay, Sonia says, I often start with the ending. Yes, it's the spark that gets me to write the story of how we got there. Yeah. Different, like I very rarely come up with the ending first, but I feel like the project doesn't really exist until I've got the ending. And then for me, but that doesn't necessarily happen right away. Hello, Arfung and Wolf. Okay. All right. I watched Lessons in Chemistry, but almost stopped after episode 2. It has what must be the laziest ending. You know, I liked Lessons in Chemistry. I can understand why people wouldn't like it. It's very stylized. I found the ending to Lessons in Chemistry solid. It made me feel okay. I was all right with it, but you know. Yes, this is another thing. Some blockbusters leave wiggle room for sequels. Some specifically, lately, it's become a whole industry-wide phenomenon of adding a little something at the end to open up a sequel. I'm not overwhelmingly a fan of that. It's good for business. It's bad for storytelling. Hello, Pelicans. Hello, Lucy Milo. Arfung also starts writing from the ending. I would say very much it is useful, at least for me, it is useful to figure out the ending and then work backwards to make sure that your story is properly leading to the ending. Very often, the whole point of knowing the ending is so that you don't get to it too soon. One of the things that happens is if you're not careful, you will not put in those elements which are going to hold off that resolution. You could easily solve the story way too early if you don't know what you're doing, or you could not put the elements in place so that the ending seems to come out of nowhere. That's the other thing that I think happens. Yeah, Casablanca I think it very much is. Once again, I don't want to give away the ending to Casablanca. Casablanca is a phenomenal movie with a great ending. But the point about that is that there's been a tension. There is a tension in Casablanca because there's a guy named Rick who has been a very engaged political and character during a war. He has had his heart broken and has retreated from engagement in the world. And the story is about what happens when the people who broke his heart, the woman he loved and her husband, return into his life and allow him to resolve that unresolved feeling of heartbreak. It's a triangle that can't easily be solved. And so therefore, at the end of Casablanca, a resolution has to come where there's two people both in love with one third person. That can't hold forever. Someone's got to win and someone's got to lose in terms of who ends up together. And so, yes, Casablanca, phenomenal ending. I love the ending of Casablanca. I find it hard to balance the foreshadowing in the right way. So the ending is still surprising. Yes. Honestly, I believe that there is no way to get things like foreshadowing fluent for yourself except doing it. Sometimes you have to do it and find out, people are saying they kind of knew halfway through what the ending was going to be. I need to take it out a little bit. You won't know sometimes until you've written it. The fact that you find it hard to balance the foreshadowing only means give it time in the process. It doesn't mean that's bad. You don't have to necessarily know how to do things easily or even know yet what they are going to be. All you need to do is commit to the process of figuring out how to make the foreshadowing work and keep working at it. Hello, Michael. Play your own style. What about when you're writing a TV pilot? Yes, this is pilots. TV is a complicated thing. The pilot itself has an ending, and that's what I would think of first, is that usually the ending establishes a new or refined question or tension that will sustain the rest of the season and possibly the rest of the series. So the answer is yes. You do want to think about what it is that you're eventually heading to, but famously, most series for a long time, Sopranos, Breaking Bad, a lot of them, they did not know how it was going to end. In the case of Breaking Bad, they knew the feeling they wanted to get to, but they didn't have the mechanics at all. Likewise, The Sopranos. The important thing is to understand the basic idea, the basic shape that you are trying to get begun, and then to make sure that your ending of the pilot opens a tension or question, sets up a situation where people are going to say, I need to know what happens to these people I have engaged with. So there's going to usually be, at the end of a pilot, a revelation or a twist or a new element or something going terribly wrong. Mad Men is another one, the great twist at the end or revelation at the end, which sets up a level of tension for the rest of the series about the main character, Don. Hi, Just Paul. Thank you. So yeah, the answer is when you're writing TV pilots, you have to think about two kinds of endings. One is where you want the series or the season to go. You don't have to solve that, but you do have to know what it is what the tension is. At very least, you need to know what the problem is going to be that the show or the characters is facing. And you have to establish that at the end of the pilot. So the end of the pilot needs to have a decisive ending, which doesn't settle everything, but decisively adds or opens the problem. Some movies have a midpoint twist which sets the story on another course. I would not say it sets it on an entirely other course. It's not like you start out with a romantic comedy and in the middle it turns into a murder mystery or a superhero movie. You usually have things as they progress through the middle, they get advanced in their complications or in the revelations or meanings. Very often what happens is what you think will solve the problem gets done, and then the problem the solution of one step of the problem leads to another bigger or more serious problem. Hello, Dino. How can you know the ending before you start writing? Right. Okay. That's what I said was, and I truly mean this. You don't need to know it when you start writing. At the point at which you figure it out, you may need to go back then after you're done with that first draft, which tells you the ending, and make sure that your build-up builds up to that ending. Because sometimes if you don't know what the ending is, you will not properly lay in what Helene was talking about, the foreshadowing or the elements that you're going to need, or you won't set up the problems that cause the ending to happen. So the answer is you do not need to know the ending before you start writing if you're the sort of person who can comfortably write without knowing the ending. But what you do probably need to do is, having gotten to the ending, to go back and make sure that the rest of it leads to that ending. If you naturally worked it out so that doesn't happen, cool. I'm not saying that's impossible. Telling the audience the movie is over. Monty Python, the Holy Grail. A magnificent ending which both does indeed decisively tell the audience this is done, and at the same time does not resolve or settle anything. Okay. Hello, Stay Foolish. Should we put the name of a song instead of describing tone? I would rather read something that describes a tone, because if you're going to name a song, all I'm going to think is, I wonder if they can get the rights to that song. I bet they can't. Whereas if you say it's a type of song or has a certain feeling, then I'm going to be involved in the story. I would like to use a kind of image montage at the end of my novel because it mirrors the beginning with just a, should I just repeat the words? Yeah, if that works, that would be really cool to actually literally repeat the beginning at the ending. That certainly can work. There's not a should. There's not a right or wrong to that. That's simply a question of, do you think you can pull it off? It sounds great to me. Yeah, sometimes the ending distinctly has to say, yeah, life goes on. All right. Glenn the Best. Oh, thank you. That's weird that it's my name and picture there. You did great work for... that's actually kind of unnerving. Thank you so much. I would advise you to make your account your own name and a picture of your choosing, just so that we don't confuse anyone. But I really appreciate that you've decided to honor me. That is very kind of you. Can we easily name good TV series with a bad ending? All right. But we can easily. Here's the thing. Yes, the problem with TV series is that very often they are created over the course of years. And in the course of those years, several things can happen. One is that they can try to extend it for, frankly, financial reasons, for popularity. Like, oh, this is doing well. Let's keep it going, even though the story itself doesn't really hold to that. And so you get things. I would argue that Dexter did that. Anyway, the point is that the things that also sometimes the people involved in the story, beginning of the story, will not actually be working on it in the later seasons. That happens too. So the answer is sometimes you just get a story where, because they hadn't figured out the ending, they can't come up with a good ending. There are people who would argue the end of Game of Thrones is exactly that situation, where they didn't know the ending when they started. I would argue that the ending of Game of Thrones is conceptually right, but presented fairly poorly in many ways. But then you get things like Lost. Lost, they famously said, we want to set something that's so dazzling that everyone's saying, how can they end this? Without them knowing how they could end it. And they simply painted themselves into a corner where they couldn't think of a good ending. A bio like Lenny, Starry, and Judy is concentrated on events leading to its ending. Yes, absolutely. Very often. Which is interesting because if you think about it, is the end of someone's life necessarily the most important thing in it? Anyway, TV show finales. The problem with TV show finales is that very often TV writers, up until the end of the 20th century, the whole point of TV writing was to never end. That a TV series was made in modules. Each episode was supposed to have a beginning, middle, and end, but the situation of the main characters couldn't change. In other words, if it's a detective story, they solve the crime, and then they go back to being a detective. So therefore, there was an anti-ending psychology to TV writing for 30 or 40 years at least, probably longer. They specifically had to do things that were not telling a story overall, because the shows they couldn't be sure that the audience was going to show up every week, so they never had a story that required you to have seen the other episodes. As a result, the people who made TV very often just weren't used to thinking about how to make an ending, and they often weren't very good at it. And then you get the later things. Game of Thrones is a particularly tricky question because they're working from an existing story by another person. And they had to come up with their ending because he hadn't written it yet. Every success or failure will have its own particular reasons. That does not mean that they are valueless, but you do have to remember that they are specific to the situations that created them. What about the ending of The Karate Kid? I hate movies to end immediately after he wins. I also love to have at least 5. Yeah. This is a matter of taste, style, preference. Some things they want to hold till the very last second and then boom, you're out. And others they want to wind down after the climax. Not a right answer to that. I was speaking of, yes. I don't know. It was dangerous, but I was kind of dazzled because for those of you who don't know, Lessons in Chemistry starts with a situation in which you find two characters meeting and you think you understand where the story is going. Things radically change. And all I can say is that dangerous? Sure. Could some people say, oh, I was watching for that story and now things are radically changed. I'm not watching anymore. That is possible. On the other hand, for me, it was like, ooh, I wonder what this is going to be about now. So I thought it was fabulous, but that's me. Actually, one of the things I liked most, I wasn't sure how much I liked it until that happened. Hi, Donna. What questions do you ask yourself when exploring if an ending is fully realizing its potential? I would say, first of all, I wouldn't worry about fully realizing its potential. That's not important. Like everyone will have a different feeling about what's the potential of a thing. The question I would ask is, what do you feel most convinced by? What do you feel most committed to? What is the one that makes you go, ooh, I like that? And that is what I would suggest you use. I'm going to suggest one of my videos, the one called Instinct, because that's really how I think you, that's where you look for your, you need to feel it more than anything else. You need to get it, to feel it, to say, I see what this means to me. Will everybody get it? No. Will everybody like it? No. So therefore, you're not trying to fulfill some external rule or potential. You're trying to fulfill it for yourself. That's how you decide. You ask yourself, what do I want this to feel like? What do I want? Like, you may want something that's very reassuring, or you might want something that's very dazzling and unexpected. Only you can decide that. It's not a right or wrong thing. Hello, Nathan. I hope you are doing well. I like the ending of the front page. The words appearing in the screen at the last seconds made me laugh so hard. Oh, yeah. Yeah, specific movies have specific wonder. I fervently defend Lost, as is one of the most powerful experiences ever to grace TV. However, no one can convince me that they knew where this story was going. Yes, I have never seen the ending of Lost. I got about a season into it. And that wasn't because I didn't like it. I just didn't particularly have time at that moment. What I would say is simply that the people who made Lost have specifically, repeatedly in interviews said, we had no idea how to get out of the corner we painted ourselves in. We had no idea. We had put in all these cool things without understanding how they go together. And we thought, we'll figure it out later. And then when later happened, they're like, we can't solve this. So that's the only thing I'd say about Lost. It's not that I am judging it one way or another. I was simply saying they famously had confessed that they didn't know how to end their own show. Movies with a twist in the middle. The Crying Game. Absolutely. But I would suggest that the twist in the middle simply reveals the story that has been going on all along, and which is then developed even more beautifully in the second half. That is not so much a change as a revealing of things that have been driving the story that we did not know. So I would say that is a story which has things happen in the middle that sometimes people won't have known what was coming. But even if you do, you'll say, this is a development. It is a deepening of the story. Sonia, I definitely think it's worth trying. I think it's a really cool idea. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Soap operas can especially have the situation that they cannot end, because the whole point of them is to continue on to be continuously entertaining. And as a result, you have to enjoy that. Part of the pleasure of some kinds of unresolved stories is the way that they just keep not letting it end. You have to have some fun with that. I think sitcom endings are always better than TV drama endings. If you mean series, that's an interesting thing. I wouldn't say always, but I would say there have been some great sitcoms that concluded, especially because sitcoms very often are not, they have no story. They have situations and then a funny half-hour thing, the beginning, middle, and end, and then the situation continues. So the question is, how do you end that? Some shows figured it out. MASH, of course, famously, Mary Tyler Moore. There's some great sitcom endings. In horror movies, very often the situation in the end is strong for the viewers, but very cruel to the protagonist. Yes. Yeah. It's one of the things that I don't love about horror movies. I recognize that what they are saying is, this is the ultimate horror. The ultimate horror is that it's not fun. The ultimate horror is that it's grim and frightening and depressing even. I don't know. Then you have some horror movies, The Exorcist, for example, where there is a resolution to the tension that does not... that maintains a sense of the awfulness, but does bring you out of it. And that's, once again, trying not to spoil things. But hi, She Breathes in Gold. Hello, Adam, the art of Adam Lum. We're talking about endings. Yes, indeed. What do I mean about Game of Thrones? Okay, not to get too into it, because this is such a controversial thing. I did not mind, and once again, I don't like to spoil things, so I'm going to say I did not mind the choice of the person that they resolved the story with. I did mind that I don't think they set it up well, that they didn't give us enough time building to that. I think partly because they didn't intend it. They figured it out late. It's not a bad idea. I just kind of felt like if you're going to do that, you should have spent more time on it earlier. I'm trying very hard not to spoil. As far as the bigger events of all the other resolutions of the story, frankly, the various fates that the surviving characters met, I actually liked all of them. I mean, I know a lot of people didn't, but I did. I just felt like the final sequence of deciding who will be on the throne was a little rushed, and the idea of who has the best story, this is not a spoiler, that felt like people who will write for a living giving way too much importance to their own interests. Art, we're almost at the end of that. I don't know. Any tips for season endings for TV where you can keep the series going without failing series expectations? That's a tricky one because it's a matter of opinion. For instance, Homeland. I really liked Homeland, and Homeland was almost every season kind of lived on its own, and yet it still was developing the story as it went on. I think Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul also did that. I think most good series, what they do is they resolve part of it, but they leave something to get you into the next part. An interesting case in point of the other way was Treme, Treme. It was on HBO. It was about New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And the thing about Treme is that you kind of get the feeling that they didn't have confidence that they would be picked up for another season. So they really resolve it pretty solidly at the end of each season. And then the next season sort of picks up with new problems, which makes sense because it's telling a story of many lives in a place. And those lives go on. But there was a distinct feeling of like, we don't know if we're ever going to come back, so we'd better be sure that we're leaving in a good place. Okay, no more questions because we're going to be stopping soon. What if we start the movie with the scene at the point of crisis? Like, how did we get to this? Yes, that is, it is completely legit to start towards the end. Usually those things are right before the resolution. In other words, you will start at the most intense question, the most big crisis, as you say. They're not actually starting with the ending. They're starting with the beginning of the ending. But it's certainly you could do that. But once again, if you do that, you need to have thought out how you're getting from there. It's hard to start out with a flash forward and not have thought out your story. I ask because I'm writing a book series, similarly strong. Yes. Yeah. The thing I would say, especially about a book series, is you have to decide what kind you're doing. If you're essentially doing a big book in parts, in other words, to say each of these books is essentially a set of chapters of a single story, or to say each book is its own book, and yet they are connected by unresolved or further developing issues. Make a choice there. Say which one you're doing. Because if you're doing one where it's like Lord of the Rings, okay, that's 3 books. It's essentially one book that was simply too big to put into, and that used to happen a lot in the 19th century. Novels like by Dickens and Dostoevsky, they often would call them 3-volume novels because they were too big to fit into a single book. But it was essentially a single book. And then you have something like there are a series of books where each book ends, like it resolves that particular problem, but then there's an ongoing one. Harry Potter, I would say, goes along those lines. And there's many. The main thing is when you're trying to come up with a series is to define for yourself, because there isn't a right or wrong, what kind of series it is so that you can do well by that choice. You know, to say, I am going to make sure that this book can be read on its own, but the developments overall are important if you want them. Blow Up and Night Moves end in a long take, and they also end up in a very sense of the point of Blow Up and Night Moves. I'll put them on the list. Is the inability of the characters to resolve their problem. So the movie ends by sort of putting in your face, this poor schmuck can't solve this. This person cannot fix this problem. They can't understand this thing. And that's the point of the story, is the failure, the tragic or existentially confounding failure of the main character. Do you think watching interviews of screenwriters helped us write? Yes, absolutely. It's definitely a good thing to do. For Game of Thrones, I didn't like the ending because I was caught up in the romance. However, it worked because it wasn't unexpected. Yes, exactly. With all endings, if you are expecting a thing different than they are wanting to do, you're going to be disappointed. Searchers had great ending. Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of them. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Horror endings. Army of Darkness, Evil Dead 3. Yeah, there's absolutely good. How about a Mission Impossible? Name a great movie with a terrible ending. That is impossible. I can't really do that. I also thought you were getting at Mission Impossible, the series of movies in which each one has a story, but there is an ongoing, unresolved story through them. But I can't actually name a great movie with a terrible ending off the top of my head. Eva's really right about this. Michael Arndt's video on endings on his website. Please take a look at this. This guy, he spent a lot of time. It's like a 2-hour video in which he analyzes 3 classic movies and breaks down how they plot. He's talking about the endings, but he's really talking about the plot. The only thing I would say about it is a good structure. It is not the only good structure. That's the only thing I would add. But Michael Arndt's video on endings, you can if you just Google that, Michael Arndt's video on endings, you'll find it. Okay. Yes, the end reveals the theme and point of the story. I absolutely agree. Struggling with starting my current script because I don't yet know how it ends. Then I can write toward that end. All I would say is this is why I outline, because I can ask myself that question. Well, how am I going to end? And you don't have to write every word to get to it. So I like to outline because it helps me figure that out. Going back to the start of the channel, let me tell you, oh yay, how glad. Really glad. I hope that this is useful. Oh, well, spoiler here, but Eva is right. Parallax View is another, I remember when I saw Parallax View is a great dark ending, spoiler. But in doing that, it makes a statement about the situation, which is it's about the question of whether or not there are conspiracies behind assassinations. And I remember when I saw that movie in the theater when I was in high school in 1975 or whenever it was that it came out. I remember being like, no, they didn't really just do that to me. It was a new thing. It was devastating and brilliant. I loved it. Okay. I felt the Game of Thrones ending was entirely expected, but I am too attached to the books to be happy with the series. Yes, yeah. That's going to be one where I can legitimately feel for anyone who hated the ending of Game of Thrones. Nonetheless, I personally felt like there was enough good in it that I was satisfied. Cool. Watch your video on instincts. Great endings to Zama. I have never heard of those. Thank you. I will look into them. Great. Great. Thank you so much. All right. Well, it is time for me to go and do my stuff and live my life. And so therefore, I hope that you will all go write something.